A new story for you. After her divorce, Sarah decided to get rid of the old doormat by the front door, the one her ex-husband had always insisted she never touch. But as she shook it out on the threshold, something fell to the floor with a soft thud. Sarah stood in the middle of her foyer, staring at the coat rack where Mark's jacket used to hang just a month ago. Now, all that was there was her old scarf and a plastic bag filled with other plastic bags she always forgot to throw out. The apartment felt too big, too quiet after the divorce. It wasn't that Mark had been a talkative man. No, for the last few years, he'd rarely said anything beyond, "Dinner's ready," or "You and your questions," again. But even his silence had been a presence. Now, there was just a void. The hum of the refrigerator, the slight drip of the kitchen faucet. From behind, the wall, the muffled murmur of a neighbor's TV. That was it. Their divorce had been handled quickly, almost like a business transaction. Mark hadn't made a fuss, hadn't haggled over anything. He just wanted it all over with, quietly. Sarah had even been surprised at the time, expecting it to be much worse. 22 years together. Their daughter, Chloe, was grown and away at college, leaving the two of them alone until they suddenly realized there was nothing left between them. That's what she'd thought at the time. The feeling had cooled. Their paths had diverged. There was nothing more to talk about. Mark packed his things in 3 trips. Each time, he brought a large duffel bag, filled it with his desk items, books, and a few folders, then left without a backward glance. Sarah would make herself coffee and sit in the kitchen while Mark was busy in the other rooms. It felt easier that way. A month passed, then a second. Slowly, Sarah began to settle into her new rhythm. Coffee in the morning, work at the community clinic until 3 p.m., then a trip to the grocery store, and then home. Every Saturday, Chloe called. She'd talk about her classes, life in the dorms, about a boy from the next major over. Sarah listened, smiled, and tried not to burden her with her own problems. Chloe knew about the divorce. She was worried and invited her to visit. But Sarah always found an excuse. "Come on, honey. I'm not some helpless old lady. I can take care of myself." And she did take care of herself. She organized the closets, threw out the old magazines Mark had piled up on the balcony and forbidden her to touch. She cleaned out the storage unit, donating 2 large bags of clothes and household items to Goodwill. Slowly, the apartment became entirely hers, free of someone else's habits, someone else's rules. Then, one afternoon, coming home from work, Sarah stopped at the front door and looked down at the doormat. It was a faded, dark brown mat with a pattern that had long since worn away, lying on the threshold for so many years that Sarah couldn't even remember when it first appeared. Its edges were curled, dust had gathered in its folds, and the thing was long overdue for the trash. But Mark had never allowed her to get rid of it. It was one of his quirks, one that had become so familiar over the years that Sarah no longer paid it any mind. If she started cleaning the entryway, Mark would immediately appear. "Don't touch that, I'll take care of it." If Sarah mentioned buying a new rug, he'd dismiss it. "Why waste the money? This one's still good." Once, about 5 years ago, Sarah had tried to wash it, just wanting to throw it in the washing machine because it had started to smell. Mark had blown up at her, a rage so sudden it startled her. He yelled that she was always meddling in things that weren't her business, that his nerves were shot. "Why are you so obsessed with that doormat?" Sarah had retreated to the kitchen to avoid a bigger fight and never brought it up again. Oh, well, she had thought, everyone has their eccentricities. But now, Mark wasn't here. No him, no rules, no scolding. Sarah took off her shoes, set her purse on the console table, and crouched down. The mat was heavier than it looked. The material was thick, compacted over the years, and stuck to the floor. Sarah lifted a corner and pulled. It came away, with a soft, ripping sound, like peeling off a bandage. Underneath, a darker rectangle remained on the tile floor, a patch of clean that probably hadn't seen the light of day in a decade. Sarah picked up the mat with both hands, held it away from her body, and shook it out right on the threshold. And that's when something clinked. A small object fell to the floor with a soft, metallic thud, bounced off the baseboard, and came to rest in the corner. Sarah lowered the mat and looked down. On the floor lay a small bundle, 2 keys, on a thin ring. One was a standard brass-colored key, like for a mailbox. Attached to the other was a small metal keychain with the number 47 engraved. On it, Sarah picked up the keys and turned them over in her fingers. She knew, for a fact, they weren't for their apartment, the garage, or her in-laws' house, back in Ohio. Then, from the folds of the doormat, a piece of paper, folded in half, slid out, followed by a few small yellowed receipts and one small photo printed on regular paper, about the size of a postcard. Sarah sat down on the floor, not caring if her pants got dirty on the dusty tile. She unfolded the paper. Her hand was trembling slightly, but not from the cold. It was a lease agreement, a copy printed from a computer, with a stamp and a signature. A studio apartment in a new condo complex on the other side of town. Apartment number 47. The date on the agreement was March of last year. Tenant: Mark Thompson. Sarah reread the date twice. March of last year. That meant the apartment was leased while they were still living together. While Mark was coming home every night, sitting at the dinner table eating her pot roast, watching the news, and complaining that his paycheck was late again, she turned over the photo. There was Mark, standing in a foyer. Not their foyer, but another one, with bright new wallpaper and a white shoe rack. His arm was around the shoulder of a young woman with dark shoulder-length hair. The woman was looking at the camera and smiling. Sarah recognized her immediately. Heather, the secretary from his office. A petite, neat woman with a round face and a mole above her lip. Sarah had seen her once at the company Christmas party Mark had taken her to 2 years ago. Heather had been sitting at the far end of the table, laughing at someone's joke, and hadn't glanced Sarah's way once. Now it was clear why. Her hands went cold. Her ears were ringing as if she were standing next to an open window in a rainstorm. Sarah sat on the floor of her foyer amidst the dust, the papers, and the receipts, and felt something inside her slowly turn over, like a heavy stone being shifted from its place. She began to examine the receipts, one by one, methodically, as if it were important. A furniture store, sofa, $1,500. Home Depot, blinds, paint, baseboards. Best Buy, microwave, electric kettle. The dates ranged from spring to fall of last year. Each receipt was small, but together they painted a picture that made Sarah feel sick. She remembered how last summer she'd asked Mark to buy a new electric kettle. The button on their old one was stuck. Mark had said, "Just be patient, honey. Money's tight right now. End of the month." And the gray cashmere scarf Sarah had given him for his birthday. One day, it just vanished from the coat rack. Mark said, "Probably left it in an Uber." Sarah was disappointed. The scarf had been expensive. She'd saved for a full month to buy it, and Mark hadn't even apologized. "It's just a scarf," he'd said. Then, and walked into the other room. Sarah sorted through these memories one by one, just like the receipts. And now, each memory had a different weight, a different color. All his complaints about having no money. All his dismissals. Later. Just be patient. Next month. All this time, the money had been there. It just wasn't flowing to their family. She remembered once looking at their joint banking app on the computer with him, and being surprised. His salary was deposited regularly, but the balance was always near zero. She had asked him about it. Mark had answered irritably, "Utilities, the mortgage, gas, lunches. Have you seen how much you spend on groceries?" Sarah had nodded and didn't ask again. And now, sitting on the cold foyer floor with these receipts in her hand, she understood. Mark hadn't just rented an apartment for another woman. He had maintained a parallel life at the expense of their family, at the expense of Sarah's silence and trust. The last thing she remembered were the final days before the divorce. When the papers had been filed and Mark was packing his things, he came back a few times, saying he'd left something behind. He spent a long time in the foyer, opening drawers, peering behind the shoe rack, muttering to himself. Once, Sarah came out of the kitchen and saw him on his knees by the door, feeling around under the console table with his hand. What are you looking for? Sarah had asked. Nothing, just an old keychain. Maybe it fell, he'd answered without looking at. Here. At the time, Sarah had just shrugged and walked away. She thought it was just stress. A person going through a divorce. Unable to find some trivial item, it happens. Now, it all made sense. He was looking for these keys, the spare set for apartment 47, which he had once hidden under the doormat just in case, so he wouldn't have to carry them and risk being discovered. And he had forgotten exactly where he'd put them. And Sarah had never once lifted that doormat in years because Mark had forbidden it. Sarah slowly gathered all the papers, stacked them, placed the keys and the photo on top, and got up from the floor. Her knees were stiff, her back ached. She walked to the kitchen, turned on the new electric kettle she'd bought after the divorce, and sat at the table. In front of her lay the small pile of papers that upended everything she thought she knew about her marriage. 22 years, and it ended like this. Sarah sat staring out the window at the streetlights behind the glass. And for the first time, she thought of nothing. She didn't cry. She wasn't angry. She didn't try to understand anything. She just sat, like a person who has just been struck and hasn't yet felt the pain. The kettle boiled with a click, then silence. Sarah didn't move. From behind the wall, a neighbor laughed, then a door slammed in the stairwell, then silence. Again. She didn't know how long she sat like that. Maybe half an hour, maybe an hour. When she finally got up, it was completely dark outside. Sarah put the papers in a dresser drawer, lay down on the bed without changing her clothes, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. She couldn't sleep. In her head, images replayed in slow motion. Mark's face at dinner when he said, "There's no money." His irritation over the doormat, his restless movements in the foyer during those last days. It all looked so different now, not as the quirks of a tired man, but as a well-organized system of lies in which Sarah was not a wife, but a prop. Toward morning, she finally dozed off for a bit, and when she woke up, the first thing she saw was the dresser drawer where the papers were. They hadn't disappeared. It wasn't a dream. Sarah washed her face, made coffee, drank it standing by the window, and made a plast decision. She was going to that address on the lease agreement, not to make a scene, not to cry. She just wanted to see it with her own eyes, to make sure it was all real, and to look Mark in the face when he realized she knew. The city bus arrived, nearly empty. 9:30 on a weekday morning. Everyone was already at work. Sarah sat by the window, clutching her purse on her lap, and watched the houses go by. Inside her purse was an envelope with the papers, the lease, the receipts, the photo. She didn't know why she brought them all. Maybe so she wouldn't feel later like she was making it all up. Maybe to show them if Mark started to deny it. Or maybe just because she couldn't leave them at home. As if, as long as the papers were with her, she had some control over the papers were papers. Situation. The journey took her across half the city. The bus swayed on the uneven road. The driver braked sharply at every stop, and Sarah repeatedly held on to the pole. She looked out the window and didn't recognize this part of town. She rarely came here, only passing through when she took Chloe to a specialist, orthodontist's office across the way. The area was changing before her eyes. Instead of the usual tract houses, there were now new, tall condo complexes with bright facades, gated courtyards, and colorful plastic playgrounds. A beautiful life, someone else's life. Sarah got off at her stop and checked the address on the lease. She found the building quickly. It stood set back a little, behind a neat parking lot. A new building, about 12 stories high. At the entrance was a glass door with an intercom and pots of petunias on the first-floor windowsills. Sarah stopped in front of the entrance and, for a few seconds, just stood there, looking up. In her building, the lobby smelled of dampness and cats. The walls were covered in marker graffiti, and the light in the hallway burned out every 2 weeks. Mark had always said, "What do you expect? The building's old. Where? Are we going to move?" Turns out he had found a place to move to himself. She pressed the apartment number on the intercom. The tone rang for a long time, and Sarah was already thinking no one was home. Then there was a click, and a soft, sleepy woman's voice said, "Yes?" Package delivery, Sarah said, the first thing that came to her mind. The door buzzed and opened. Sarah stepped into the lobby and immediately felt the difference. Clean, bright, the walls covered in smooth plaster, not peeling paint. The elevator was new and silent, with a mirror and buttons that weren't sticky. Floor 4. Sarah got out of the elevator and turned left. The doors were all abesite. Uniform dark brown with neat numbers. 45, 46, 47. She stopped in front of door. Number 47, and realized her breathing was too fast. Her heart was pounding in her throat. Her palms were damp. Why was she here? What was she going to say? Hi, I'm the ex-wife. I've come to see where my money was spent. No, Sarah herself didn't understand why she had come. Maybe she needed to see this door to make sure this door was real, that behind it was a real apartment, a real woman, a real lie. Sarah pressed the doorbell. Silence behind the door. Then she heard the light. Barefoot steps on a hardwood floor. The lock clicked. The door opened. In the doorway stood Heather. No hairstyle, no makeup, wearing a long sweater that revealed her bare ankles. A homey, disheveled look. Nothing like what Sarah had seen at that company party. Then Heather had been in a dress with bright lipstick and a confident smile. Now, before Sarah stood an ordinary woman in her 30s who had just woken up and hadn't fully grasped what was happening. And then she grasped it. Sarah saw it happen in a single second, like a switch being flipped. Heather blinked, took a small step back, and gripped the doorknob. She didn't ask, "Who are you looking for?" She didn't ask, "Can I help?" "You?" She just stood and looked at Sarah with the eyes of someone who had been caught, and that look was enough. For a few seconds, they were silent. From inside the apartment came the smell of coffee and something fried eggs or bacon. On the foyer floor was a pair of Datecleys at an axe, familiar, dark brown men's shoes. Sarah remembered buying them with Mark III. Years ago at the mall, Mark had spent a long time choosing between brown and black. Sarah had said, "Get the brown, they suit you." "Who is it?" A voice came from inside the apartment. Sarah recognized it. Instantly low, a little hoarse from sleep. For 22 years, she had heard it every morning. Heavy, shuffling steps and slippers. Then, in the hallway, behind Heather, Mark appeared, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, a mug in his hand. He was walking, looking down at his mug, and said casually, "Heather, if it's that courier again, just tell him." He lifted his eyes, saw Sarah, and froze. The mug in his hand trembled. Coffee spilled over the rim and dripped onto the floor. Mark didn't notice. His face turned pale, as if someone had drained all the color from it. He stood in the hallway of someone else's apartment, next to a woman who was not his wife, and stared at his ex-wife, who stood on the threshold and saw everything. The silence probably lasted 10 seconds, but to Sarah, it felt like 5 minutes. She stood very straight, her purse on her shoulder, her hands at her sides. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't brandish the papers. She just looked. Then she slowly reached into her pocket, took out the keys with the Plectus and 8, number 47 keychain, and held them out on her open palm. "You were looking for these?" she asked quietly. Mark stared at the keys, his Adam's apple bobbing as if he were trying to swallow something. Heather, behind him, took another step back and crossed her arms over her chest as if she were cold. "Sarah," he began, and his voice was like that of a person woken up in the frozen .9. Middle of the night. "Listen, it's not what you think." "Then what do I think?" Sarah didn't pull her hand back. The keys lay on her palm, glinting under the hallway light. This apartment. I rented it temporarily. For work. I needed a place." "Where?" "For work," Mark stammered. "For work," Sarah repeated, and in her voice there was neither anger nor sarcasm, just a weary statement. "With a $1,500 sofa and a microwave from our budget." Mark swallowed, glanced at Heather, then back at Sarah. "I'll explain everything. To you." "Really? I just didn't get around to it." 22 years and you didn't get around to it." Sarah didn't raise her voice. She spoke like a clerk at the post office dictating an address flat, clear, without expression. And that seemed to unnerve Mark more than if she had screamed. Heather stood at the end of the hallway and was silent. Sarah glanced past Mark into the apartment's foyer and began to recognize things. The gray cashmere scarf was hanging on a hook near the mirror, the same scarf she had given him for his birthday. The one he said was lost in an Uber. And on the back of a chair inside the room, Sarah tilted her head slightly and saw a glimpse of it lay a green wool blanket with tassels on the ends. Sarah had bought it last October, and a week later, it disappeared. Mark had said, "Probably got eaten by moths. I threw it out." Sarah had been sad at the time. The blanket wasn't cheap. Mark hadn't just lied. He had built his second life from the pieces of his first, stealing bit by bit from their household and moving it here, to this clean apartment with new wallpaper, for a woman who was younger, quieter, and didn't ask too many questions. "Mark," Sarah said, and he flinched at his full name without the usual Marky she used. "I'm not going to talk to you here. I came for only one thing. To make sure." "Make sure of what?" he pressed. "That I wasn't mistaken." Sarah lowered her hand, and the keys went back into her pocket. She turned and walked toward the elevator. Behind her, she heard Heather's voice, a quick, frightened whisper. "Mark, you," said she didn't know. And his angry, strained reply, "Shut up, not now." Sarah pressed the elevator button and stood, staring at the closed doors. Her heart was still pounding, but her hands were no longer shaking. Behind her, a door slammed. Mark came out into the hallway. "Sarah, wait." She didn't turn around. "Sarah, come on, let's talk like adults. What are you doing here? We're divorced. What business is it of yours where I live?" The elevator arrived. The doors opened. Sarah stepped inside, and only then did she turn to face Mark. He stood in the hallway, barefoot, in a wrinkled t-shirt, with a coffee stain on his sweatpants. He was no longer the confident man who, for 22 years, had controlled everything in their home, from the budget to the doormat. He was a man caught in the act, and all his self-control had bled away like the coffee from his mug. "It's my business," Sarah said, "because you paid for all of this with our money, and I'm going to prove it." The elevator doors closed. Sarah went down, out of the building, and walked to Tuationzatter, the bus stop. Her legs felt weak, her head light and empty, like after a long illness and going outside for the first time. She sat on the bench at the bus stop and just sat there for 10 minutes, watching the cars go by. It was a strange feeling. Not anger, not pain, not sadness, something else. Like, you've lived for a long time in a room with a funhouse mirror and gotten used to your own reflection. Then someone shows you a flat mirror, and you see that everything was crooked. Not you, but the world around you. All his words, his promises, his excuses, they were all just props to keep that distorted mirror from falling, and you stood beside it, believing that's how it was supposed to be. The bus came, and Sarah sat in the same seat by the window. Outside the glass flashed the same new houses, the same playgrounds, the same parked cars. But now, Sarah saw it all differently. She wasn't thinking about Mark, not about Heather. She was thinking about herself, about the years when she served him a plate of dinner every night and asked how his day was. And Mark ate her cooking and lied. Day after day, month after month, and never wavered, never slipped up, never looked at her in a way that would make her suspicious. Sarah got home around lunchtime, took off her shoes in the foyer, looked at the dark rectangle on the tile floor where the doormat used to be, and walked to the Deesry Cleater kitchen. She turned on the kettle, took the envelope of papers out of her purse, and laid it on the table. She poured herself some tea, sat down, and sat for a long time, holding the mug with both hands, warming her fingers. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside the window, pigeons walked along the edge of the roof, and, somewhere below in the courtyard, a mother called her son. "Jake, come home. Jake, do you hear me?" Sarah sipped her tea, put down the mug, and picked up her phone. She looked in. Her contacts for the number of Lisa, an old classmate who worked as a family law attorney. They hadn't spoken in 3 years. After the divorce, Sarah had rarely spoken to anyone. She didn't want to be pitied or asked questions. But now, she didn't need a friend. She needed a professional. Lisa answered on the third ring. Sarah, wow, what a surprise. What's up? Lisa, I need a consultation. Can't talk over the phone. Can I come to your office tomorrow? Of course. What's the problem? Sarah paused for a moment, then said, I found something after the divorce, and I think the division of assets needs to be revisited. On the other end, Lisa was also silent, then said in a calm, professional tone, without any prying questions, come in tomorrow at 10. Bring everything you found. We'll take a look. Sarah put down her phone and looked out the window. The streetlights hadn't come on yet. It was still too early. The day was slowly fading, and the sky was turning a purplish-gray color that only appears in November. Sarah sat and, for the first time in a long time, felt something like solid ground under her feet. Not happiness, no, not relief, just clarity. She knew what she was going to do next. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she was no longer willing to pretend that nothing had happened. Lisa's office was on the second floor of an old brick building, squeezed between a pharmacy and a boutique. Sarah climbed the creaking stairs, pushed open the rablanet door with a plaque that read, Legal Consultation, and found herself in a small waiting room that smelled of coffee and paper. A middle-aged secretary with glasses on a chain pointed to a door at the end of the hall. Miss Miller is waiting for you. Lisa was sitting at her desk, which was piled with folders, typing something quickly on her laptop. Seeing Sarah, she stood up, gave her a brief, professional hug, and then pointed to the chair opposite her. Sit? Tea? Coffee? No, thank you. Let's just get to it. Lisa sat down, folded her hands on the desk, and looked at Sarah attentively, like a doctor who already suspects the diagnosis but is waiting for the patient to tell the story herself. Sarah took the envelope out of her purse, opened it, and laid everything out on the table, the lease agreement, the receipts, the photo, the keys. She arranged them neatly in a row, like exhibits. Lisa silently picked up the lease, read it quickly, and set it down. Then the receipts, one by one, slowly reading the dates and amounts. She looked at the Prasanarta then Talsit. Photo last, stared at Mark's face for a moment, then placed it back on the pressed table, face down. Tell me, she said. Everything, from the beginning. And Sarah told her, from the beginning, from the doormat, from the night she decided to clean the foyer, how the keys fell, how she unfolded the paper, how she went to the address, how Heather opened the door with a face not of surprise but of fear, how Mark appeared in the hallway with a coffee mug and turned pale, how she saw her things in that strange apartment, the scarf, the blanket. Lisa listened without interrupting. Only once did she clarify. The apartment was in his name? Sarah nodded. On the lease, the tenant was Mark Thompson. Lisa jotted something down in her notepad and went back to listening. When Sarah finished, the room was quiet. In the pharmacy next door, the bell on the door chimed. Lisa leaned back in her chair and for a few seconds was silent, tapping her pen on her notepad. Here's the thing, she said finally. What you found is good, but for court, we need more. These receipts are circumstantial evidence. We need the bank, statements from your joint account, the transaction history for the period. The lease was active. If we can show that a regular amount of money, matching the lubling, rent and these purchases, was coming out of your joint account, that will be a very strong argument. I can request the statements? Sarah asked. The account was joint, but I haven't used it since the divorce. You can. You are a co-owner of the account, and the bank is obligated to provide the transaction history for the period the account was active. Write a formal request. Bring your ID and the divorce decree. I'll give you a template for the letter. Lisa opened a desk drawer, took out a form, and began to fill it out in a quick, practiced hand. One more thing, she continued without looking up. Was your asset division based on an agreement or a court order? An agreement. He proposed it, I agreed. The apartment for me, the car for him. The rest split 50-50. Savings? What savings, Lisa? Sarah smiled bitterly. He always said there was. No money. I just believed him. At the time of the divorce, there was only about $2,000 in the account. We split it. Lisa looked up and met Sarah's gaze over her glasses. Well, this is the key point. If we can prove that he systematically withdrew funds from the family budget to finance an apartment and another woman, then that division agreement can be challenged because it was made based on incomplete information. I didn't know that a portion of the marital assets had already been spent by him. Alone. That's called acting in bad faith during the division of property. What does that mean in practice? In practice, the court can review the terms of the division. It can order him to compensate you for your share of the funds that were spent without your knowledge. The amount might not be fantastic, but over a year and a half, it could add up to quite a bit. Rent, furniture, electronics, living expenses, all. Together, it could be tens of thousands of dollars. Sarah was silent. Tens of thousands of dollars. The same money that he said never existed. That wasn't enough to buy a new kettle, to renovate the bathroom, for a winter jacket for Chloe when she was still living at home. Each time, Mark would frown and say, "Next month, honey, now's not the time." And all the while, that money was flowing to someone else's sofa and someone else's microwave. "I'll do whatever it takes," Sarah said. The next 2 weeks she spent at the bank, in lines, at document scanners. She got the bank statements, a thick stack of papers with tiny print, where every line was a transaction. She brought them to Lisa. They sat in her office one evening. The secretary had already gone home. Only the emergency lights were on. In the hallway. They dissected the statements, line by line. Lisa ran her finger down the columns and marked the relevant amounts with a highlighter. "Look at this. Every month, on this date, a transfer of the same amount. This is the rent. And here," she turned a page, "one-time expenses. The furniture store, on May 23rd, Home Depot on June 16th, Best Buy on July 4th. It all matches receipts you found." "What's the total?" Sarah asked. Lisa picked up a calculator, quickly pressed the buttons, wrote a number in the plus margin of the statement, and showed it to Sarah. "This much, over 14 months. And this is only what went through the joint account. If he paid in cash, we can't track it." Sarah looked at the number. It was much larger than she had expected. Huge. With that money, they could have renovated their apartment or saved for Chloe's rent when she wanted to move out of the dorms, or simply lived normally without counting every dollar before payday. "We file the lawsuit?" Lisa asked. "File it." Lisa prepared the lawsuit in a week. Sarah signed the papers in her kitchen, at the same table where she had served dinner to Mark for years. She signed them with a neat, firm hand, without a single tremor. A copy of the lawsuit was sent to Mark by mail. His reaction came that same evening. The phone rang at 10:30 p.m. when Sarah was already in bed, scrolling through a newsfeed to distract herself. Mark's name appeared on the screen. She stared at the flashing screen for a long time, then answered. "What the hell is this?" His voice was angry, strained, as if he were speaking through clenched teeth. "What lawsuit, Sarah? We settled everything. We signed the papers. You got the apartment. What more do you want?" "I got the apartment that you didn't renovate for 20 years because there was no money. Turns out the money was there, wasn't it? It just wasn't going." "Here." "That's bullshit. What money? You barely worked. I was the one supporting everything. I worked, Mark. I've worked my whole life. And my salary also went into the self-joint account. The account you used to pay for someone else's apartment." Silence. Sarah could hear his heavy, ragged breathing, like when he was angry, and couldn't find the words. "Listen," he said then, more quietly in a different tone. "Let's meet and talk this over calmly. Without lawyers, without court. Why drag all this out? Because you already dragged everything you could out of our home." She hung up and muted her phone. It continued to light up with incoming calls for a long time. Mark called again and again, then started sending texts. Sarah didn't read them, placed the phone face down on the nightstand, and turned off the light. The calls continued every day. At first, they were angry. "You'll regret this. I'll get a better lawyer. You don't know who you're dealing with." A few days later, the tone changed. Mark started calling during the day, during his lunch break when Sarah was at work. She answered once out of 5 calls, stood for a moment in the clinic hallway and listened. "Sarah, come on, let's be human about this. I'm not denying the apartment. Existed. Fine. It existed. We're divorced now. Why bring it up? Because you paid for it with our money. It wasn't just our money. Fine, some of it. But I can use my own money, can't? I? Who can separate it now? The lawyers will separate it. And she hung up. A week later, the pleading began. Mark's voice became different, soft, pleading, almost pathetic. He called late at night when Sarah was drinking tea in the kitchen and said things he had never said before. I was wrong, I know. But Heather, she meant nothing to me. Really, it was just a stupid thing. I was confused. I wasn't myself. You understand? The pressure at work, at home, you were always so quiet. I didn't know where to go. I was quiet because you never talked to me, Sarah replied. And as for where to go, you knew exactly where. To apartment 47. Sarah. Mark, I'm not discussing this with you. Everything goes through the court. She hung up and finished her tea. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't break. For the first time in 22 years, she was speaking to him as an equal, not as a woman accustomed to giving in to avoid a fight. About Heather, Sarah found out by accident. Lisa called a few days later and said casually, "By the way, I did a little digging. It seems that Heather has already moved out of that apartment. The lease was terminated. The landlord confirmed." She packed her things and left. Didn't leave a forwarding address. That was fast, Sarah said. They're always fast. As long as the man has a secret, they're there. The moment the secret is out and it smells like a lawsuit, they disappear. Sarah imagined how it happened, how Mark showed up at that apartment, maybe with flowers, maybe with apologies, and Heather was gone. Her things packed, the keys. On the table, the sink clean, no note, no explanation, just vanished as if she had never existed. And Mark stood in the middle of an empty apartment that smelled of someone else's perfume and dust, and realized he was alone. Without a wife, without a mistress, without money, and without the beautiful double life he had so carefully constructed. Sarah didn't feel any pleasure. The image didn't make her happy. It was more of a hollow feeling, like watching someone else's house burn down. It's terrible, but it's not your house burning. Not anymore. The hearing was scheduled a month later. Sarah prepared for it calmly. Lisa handled the case with confidence. The documents were in order. The evidence was in hand. The night before the hearing, Sarah couldn't sleep well. Not because she was afraid, but because of a strange feeling that tomorrow something would end definitively. Not the marriage that was already over, but the version of her life where she was a wife, a homemaker, a partner. A version that, it turned out, had only existed in her head. The next morning, she put on a gray suit she used to wear to parent-teacher conferences when Chloe was still in school. The suit was formal, neat, and a little too big. Sarah had lost some weight in recent months without even realizing it. She looked at herself in the foyer mirror, straightened her collar, and left. The courthouse was cool and smelled of vinyl flooring. Lisa was waiting for her, in front of the courtroom door, wearing a dark dress with a folder under her arm, looking collected and calm. They sat down next to each other. Lisa arranged her documents and said quietly, "Just tell the truth, short and to the point. I'll handle the rest." Mark arrived with his lawyer, a young man in a tight suit who was flipping through papers as if he'd just received them that morning. Mark sat across from them, not looking at Sarah. He looked thinner. There were dark circles under his eyes. His shirt was wrinkled. Sarah looked at him and thought that for the first time in months, he looked like himself, without the mask of a caring husband, without the role of a tired provider. Just a man caught in a lie who didn't know how to get out of it. The hearing began. Lisa spoke clearly, presenting the documents one by one to the judge, the lease agreement, the bank statements, the receipts. During the marriage, she explained, the respondent systematically spent funds from the baseless, exless spent funds, joint budget to finance a separate residence, and another woman, concealing this from his wife. The property division agreement was signed by the plaintiff based on incomplete information. She was unaware of the hidden expenses. Mark's lawyer tried to argue, saying the expenses were insignificant, that Mark had the right to manage his own funds, that the respondent's private life was not the subject of the hearing. Lisa countered calmly, "This is not about private life, but about financial obligations within a marriage. A joint account means joint money. The systematic teen/PACA. Withdrawal of funds without a partner's knowledge is grounds for a review. The judge, a woman in her 50s with a short haircut and tired eyes, listened to both sides in silence, making notes. Then she asked Sarah to answer a few questions. Were you aware of the existence of the rented apartment during the marriage? No, Sarah said. I only found out after the divorce. How? I found documents hidden in the apartment. Did you ask for an explanation from the respondent? Yes. I went to the address and confirmed it myself. He admitted it. Did the respondent try to explain his expenses? At first he said the apartment was for work. Then he said it was temporary. Then he said Heather meant nothing to him. His explanation changed every day. In the room, someone at the next table chuckled quietly, an elderly couple, waiting for their turn, and the wife nudged her husband. Mark stared at the table, twirling a pen in his fingers. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Mark just shook his head. Lisa concluded by stating the total proven amount of expenses from the family. Budget to finance the rented apartment. She named the figure. Spent by the Blonksel Norme now, respondent unilaterally, without the plaintiff's consent or knowledge. Based on this, we petition to review the terms of the property division and to compel the respondent to provide compensation for half of the aforementioned amount. The judge announced a recess. Sarah and Lisa went out into the hallway. Lisa poured water from a cooler and gave a cup to Sarah. You were great, clear and direct. What do you think? Sarah asked, squeezing the plastic cup in her hand. I think the decision will be in our favor. The evidence base is strong, and the judge can see it. His lawyer, frankly, is weak. He hasn't presented any concrete arguments. The recess lasted 20 minutes. Sarah stood by the window in the hallway and looked out at the gray asphalt courtyard, the parked cars, a single tree with fallen leaves. Mark walked by without his lawyer. He paused, as if wanting to say something, then changed his mind and kept walking. Sarah noticed he was stooping more than before, and his shoes were the same brown ones she had once helped him pick out. When the hearing resumed, the judge read her decision. The lawsuit was granted. In part, the court recognized that the respondent had spent funds from the joint budget without his wife's knowledge during the marriage. The terms of the property division agreement were to be reviewed. The respondent was ordered to compensate the plaintiff for half of the documented expenses. The amount set was slightly lower than what Lisa had requested. The court excluded a few receipts that couldn't be definitively linked to the rented apartment, but the majority was recognized. Mark listened to the verdict in silence. His lawyer gathered his papers and quickly left. Mark remained sitting at his table, staring straight ahead. Sarah stood up, took her copy of the decision, put it in her purse, and walked to the blank exit. On the steps of the courthouse, she stopped. It was late November. The air smelled of damp leaves and exhaust fumes. Sarah buttoned her jacket up to her chin, adjusted her purse on her shoulder, and took a deep breath. Not a breath of victory, not of relief, just a deep breath, like a person who has been carrying a heavy load for a long time and has finally set it down. Lisa came out after her and stood beside her. Heading home? Home, Sarah said. They walked down the steps and toward the bus stop. Halfway there, Lisa said, You know what strikes me? He never once said he was sorry during the whole hearing. Sarah nodded. She had noticed it too, but she wasn't surprised. In 2 years, Mark had never once apologized, not for the lies about money, not for yelling about the doormat, not for the lost scarf. He just wasn't capable of it, or didn't feel the need. And now, even when he was caught, exposed, and ordered to pay, he just sat there and was silent. Not because he was sorry, but because he still felt there was nothing to be sorry for. Sarah got home before dark, opened the door, stepped into the foyer, and stopped. Everything was as usual. The mirrored closet, the coat rack, the old shoes by the wall, and the doormat. It was lying in the corner, rolled up, leaning against the wall like a forgotten umbrella. Sarah hadn't thrown it out. Then, that first night, she'd been too busy with the papers, calling Lisa, going to the address. Then she'd been occupied with the bank and the documents, and the doormat just stood in the corner, waiting. Sarah took off her shoes, hung up her jacket, and went to the kitchen. She turned on the kettle, got butter and bread from the fridge, sliced a piece, buttered it, and sat by the window. She chewed slowly, looking out at the courtyard. Kids were riding bikes on the still dry asphalt, and a young mother, with a stroller, stood by the entrance talking on the phone. An ordinary evening, an ordinary courtyard. But inside Sarah, something was different. Not joy that was still far away, but silence. A real, not empty, silence. As if a noisy TV in the next room, one she'd gotten so used to hearing she no longer noticed it, had finally been turned off by someone. And now she could hear the ticking of the clock, the whisper of the wind outside the window, the gurgle of water in the pipes. The world hadn't disappeared. It had just become quiet. Sarah finished her bread, drank her tea, and went back to the foyer. She looked at the doormat in the corner. The fabric was dirty, worn down to the white threads, with curled edges that smelled of dust and old floors. Sarah picked it, went up with both hands, held it for easier carrying, and left the apartment. She walked down the stairs. The elevator didn't stop on the second floor, and her legs were still strong enough. In the courtyard, it was cool, smelling of damp earth and a little smoke. One of the neighbors was burning leaves in the backyard, even though it had long been forbidden. The large dumpster was in the corner of the building, near the garages. Sarah walked up to it, lifted the lid, and pushed the doormat inside. It fell to the bottom with a soft thud. Sarah closed the lid and stood there, holding on to the cold metal edge. She stood and looked at the closed dumpster, as if waiting for something. Then she let go of her hands, dusted them off, and walked back. Halfway to the entrance, she glanced back. The dumpster stood as it always did. Nothing had changed. But Sarah felt lighter. Not in weight, but overall in her shoulders, in her step. As if she had just taken off a coat she had been wearing for so long she had forgotten it could be taken off. The first week after the verdict, Sarah just lived her life. She went to work at the clinic, saw patients, filled out medical records, had lunch in the cafeteria with her colleagues. Nothing special, but little things started to change. She didn't notice it right away. At first, subconsciously, then clearly. For example, one morning she stood in the foyer and realized that the floor by place, the door, the darker rectangle where the doormat had lain for years, no longer bothered her. Sarah bought a small rug at a home goods store, a bright one with a short, pleasant pile, and laid it on the threshold. She stood on it barefoot and thought, just like this, simple and normal, no secrets underneath. Then she redid the entire foyer. She repainted the walls. They used to be a pale green, a color Mark had chosen about 15 years ago, and wouldn't let her change. "It's a good color. What don't you like about it?" he would say if Sarah brought up redecorating. Now, Sarah went to the hardware store, stood for a long time in front of the rack, touching the color samples, and chose a warm cream, almost a peach color. The salesperson, a young girl with a nose ring, asked, "For what square footage?" Sarah estimated and said, "The foyer and hallway, about 65 square feet." The girl did the math, gave her a can of paint and a roller, and Sarah went home to paint her walls. She painted for 2 evenings. It was the first time in her life she had done it, herself. In the past, any renovation was Mark's responsibility, or rather, a responsibility he always postponed indefinitely. Sarah permanently stained a pair of jeans with paint, got a smudge on her forehead, and once stepped in the paint tray, leaving a creamy footprint on the floor. But when she was done, she stood in the foyer and looked at the new walls, and something inside her untwisted another turn, like a slowly loosening nut. Then the kitchen, not a renovation, just a decluttering. Sarah took a stack of 20 manias, old plates out of the top cabinet that Mark had brought from his mother's house, and wouldn't let her throw away. They're mementos. Don't touch them. The plates were heavy with a brown rim. One was cracked. Sarah carefully stacked them in a cardboard box and took them outside, leaving them on the windowsill and the stairwell, as people do when something is still good but no longer needed. By evening, the box was gone. Someone had taken it. Good. She started calling people, not right away, gradually. First, Brenda, a former coworker she used to be close with. But then Mark started complaining. "Brenda, again? You two are always on the phone for 3 hours." Sarah started calling. Less often, then stopped altogether. Brenda wasn't offended. She had gone through a divorce herself 5 years ago and understood everything. When Sarah called and said, "Brenda, hi, it's me. It's been a while," Brenda laughed and replied, "Well, finally, Saturday, coffee shop, my treat." They met at a small coffee shop on the corner that smelled of cinnamon and vanilla and sat there for 3 hours. Sarah told her everything about the doormat, the keys, apartment 47, the court case. Brenda listened, shook her head, poured herself more coffee, and never once said, "I told you so." Instead, she said, "You know what's most important? You didn't fall apart. You could have just sat there and cried, but you went and sorted it out." "I cried too," Sarah admitted. "Once. The night after I came back from that apartment. But after that, that's what strength is," Brenda said. "Don't think strong people don't cry. Strong people cry, and the next morning they go to a lawyer." Sarah smiled. For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile, not a polite or forced one. Then Chloe called the usual Saturday call. But this time, Sarah didn't dodge the questions and say everything was fine. She told her daughter about the court case. Briefly, without the details. But honestly, "Mom," Chloe said after a pause, "I'm so angry at him. So angry I can't even—" "Don't be angry," Sarah replied. "It's his life, his choices. We're separate. Now. But he deceived you for years." "Yes, but I'm not being deceived anymore. And that's what matters." Chloe was silent, then said, "Mom, I'm coming home next weekend. I want to give you a hug. Come home, I'll make my famous lasagna." "Your lasagna is a powerful argument." They both laughed, and Sarah felt something warm inside her, not suddenly, but slowly, like a cold radiator finally filling with hot water. The weeks passed. December brought a persistent drizzle that made dusk seem to arrive earlier. Sarah got used to her new rhythm. Work, home, occasional coffee, with Brenda, an evening walk in the park when the weather allowed. She signed up at the local library, not for books, but for a knitting club that met there every Thursday. 5 women of various ages, knitting needles, tea from a thermos, and light conversation. Sarah hadn't knitted in 20 years. Her fingers were stiff. She often dropped stitches. But that wasn't the point. The point was to sit among people and feel that life wasn't over. It had just taken a turn. Her encounter with Mark happened in mid-December. Sarah stopped by the Problis supermarket after work. She needed to buy oil, rice, and detergent. She was standing in front of the aisle, comparing prices, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Sarah." She turned. Mark was standing there with a shopping basket. In it were a loaf of bread, a package of hot dogs, and a bottle of milk, a bachelor's set. He looked older than he had 2 months ago in court. A gaunt face, a thin stubble, his jacket buttoned crookedly, one button in the wrong hole. Under his eyes were no longer dark circles, but puffy, dark bags. "Hi," Sarah said flatly. "Hi, how are you?" "Fine." Silence. Mark shifted the basket from one hand to the other, looked at the shelves, then back at Sarah. "Listen, I wanted to say, well, basically, you were right about everything. I should have done it all differently." Sarah looked at him and waited. Maybe now he would finally say, "I'm sorry." Maybe now something genuine would come out of him, without excuses and justifications. But Mark fell silent, bit his lip, and added, "Heather, by the Perseven de Pronzer siled." She moved far away. "I'm alone now." That was it. No apology, no remorse, just a complaint. "I'm alone." As if Sarah was supposed to feel sorry for him. As if he still didn't understand that the problem wasn't Heather, not the apartment, and not even the money. The problem was that for 22 years, he had looked her in the eye and lied. And even now, standing in the supermarket with hot dogs in his basket, he couldn't bring himself to say a simple, human word. "Sorry." "I'm sorry you're lonely," Sarah said, "but I can't help you with that." She put the rice in her shopping bag, nodded to him, and walked to the checkout. She didn't look back, not because she was angry, not because she wanted to prove a point, simply because there was no reason to look back. At the checkout, an elderly woman with a stack of coupons was ahead of her, and the line was moving slowly. Sarah stood there, holding her shopping bag, and thought not about Mark but about herself. A while ago, after a meeting like this, she wouldn't have been able to sleep all night, replaying Mark's words in her head, searching for hidden meanings, doubting whether she had done the right thing. But now, there was nothing. They met, they talked, she left, like with a neighbor. That evening, Sarah came home, put away her groceries, cooked a simple rice dish with a side of vegetables, like from her childhood, when her mother would serve her a plate and say, "Eat up, honey, so you'll be strong." She ate, washed the dishes, wiped the table, and then walked to the foyer. She stood on her new, bright rug, looked at the fresh cream-colored walls, the neat coat rack, and the mirror that reflected a 54-year-old woman with tired but calm eyes. This foyer was hers. This house was hers. This life, finally, was just hers. Sarah turned off the light, went into the bedroom, and lay down. Outside, the rain was coming down hard. The yellow glow of a streetlight reflected off the drops on the window, creating moving shadows that danced slowly on the ceiling. From behind the wall, a neighbor's music played softly, something old, from the On the Merity. Songs on the radio in her youth. Sarah closed her eyes and thought, "It's strange how one thing can turn. Everything upside down, an old, dirty, worn-out doormat that nobody wanted, and underneath it lay the truth that had been hidden from her for years. And the scary part wasn't that the truth was cruel. It was how easily she could have never found it. If she hadn't decided to clean up. If she had listened to Mark's habit and not touched it. If she had continued to live, without asking questions. But she had touched it, lifted it, shaken it out. And everything collapsed. Sometimes the most terrible secrets aren't in a phone or a pocket. Sometimes they lie for years right under your feet. And the hardest part isn't finding them, but finding the courage to finally lift them up and see what's there.